Diamonds don't lie. Neither do the people who taught you to spot a fake one. Luca Ferraro learned that lesson twice in his life. The first time from his grandfather, who ran a jewelry counter in the old country before he ever ran anything else. The second time from a woman he hadn't seen in 6 years, standing under the same warm lights, holding a loupe to her eye like she'd never left the trade at all. He froze in the doorway of Bellamy and Sons with a black velvet box already burning a hole in his coat pocket, a ring inside it meant for another woman entirely. And for the first time since he'd taken over his father's empire, Luca Ferraro didn't know what to do next. That's where this story starts. But to understand why a man who never hesitated over anything suddenly couldn't move his feet, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the night his father sat him down at the head of a long mahogany table and told him it was time to get married. Luca Ferraro did not believe in fate. He believed in leverage, in timing, in the careful architecture of favors owed and favors collected. He had built his entire adult life on the principle that nothing happened by accident, that every good outcome could be traced back to a decision someone made on purpose. So when his father, Salvatore, called him into the study on a wet Tuesday night and told him the Conti family had finally agreed to the match, Luca didn't hear romance. He heard a merger. "Isabella is a good woman," Salvatore said, swirling a glass of red he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He was 71 years old and still spoke like a man giving orders to soldiers, even to his only son. Beautiful, educated, respectful of the family. Her father controls the ports from Palermo to Naples. You marry her, we stop bleeding money on shipping fees to men who hate us. It is simple math, Luca. I know the math, Papa. Luca stood by the window, watching rain streak down the old leaded glass. The study smelled the way it always had, of cedar smoke and old paper, and the particular dust that settled on a house that had seen 3 generations of the same family bury the same kind of secrets. I'm not arguing the math. Then what are you arguing? Luca didn't answer right away. He wasn't a man who filled silence just to be polite. He'd learned that from his father too, the same way he'd learned to read a room before he spoke in it, the same way he'd learned that a raised voice was almost always a sign of weakness, and a lowered one was almost always a threat. I'm not arguing anything, he finally said. I'm doing it. Salvatore studied his son for a long moment, the way he studied every deal before he signed it. You don't love her. I respect her. That's more than most men get. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer I've got, Papa. Luca turned from the window. He was 34 years old, built like a man who had spent his 20s settling disputes with his hands before he learned it was cheaper to settle them with lawyers. There was a thin, white scar through his left eyebrow that nobody outside the family ever asked about, and eyes so dark and still that grown men had been known to lose their nerve mid-sentence just looking into them. I gave up on the other thing a long time ago. This is what's left. I'll take it. Salvatore didn't push. He never did, not with Luca, not once his son had proven he could run the family's businesses better than his father ever had. He simply nodded, satisfied, and refilled his glass. Buy her a ring worth the alliance, Salvatore said. Something she'll wear proudly in front of her father's men. Go to Bellamy's on 5th. Old man Bellamy's father cut the stone for your grandmother's wedding ring. Tell him who you are. He'll take care of you. That should have been the end of the conversation. It should have been a simple errand, the kind of task Luca could have delegated to Antonio, his second in command, without a second thought. Instead, 3 days later, on a gray Thursday afternoon with the city smelling of wet concrete and the last cold breath of a winter that refused to leave, Luca went himself. He told himself it was because a ring like that deserved a man's own eye, not a bodyguard's judgment. He told himself a lot of things on the drive over. None of them were the real reason, and some small, buried part of him knew that even as he said them. Bellamy and Sons occupied a narrow storefront on 5th Street, wedged between a bakery that had been there longer than the block itself and a tailor shop with faded gold lettering in the window. The jewelry store didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. Everyone who mattered in this city knew exactly what kind of money walked through that unassuming green door, and everyone who didn't matter walked right past it without a second glance. Luca stepped inside at exactly 2 in the afternoon, the small brass bell above the door announcing him with a sound too delicate for a man his size. Antonio stayed outside by the car, arms crossed, watching the street the way he always did, out of habit more than necessity. Nobody bothered Luca Ferraro in broad daylight on 5th Street. Not anymore. Not since he'd made an example of the last man who tried. The inside of the shop was warm and hushed, lit by soft gold light that made every case glow like it held something sacred. Glass counters ran the length of the room, each one a shallow museum of diamonds and sapphires and old estate pieces waiting for new hands to wear them. The air smelled faintly of polish and old velvet. An older man in a gray cardigan looked up from behind the register and broke into the kind of smile shopkeepers reserved for their best customers. "Mr. Ferraro, it's been too long." "Bellamy." Luca shook the old man's hand. "My father sends his regards. Says your father cut the stone for my grandmother's ring." "He did. Beautiful piece. I still have the sketches somewhere in the back." Bellamy's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth. "Your father called ahead. Said you'd be looking for something for a special occasion." "An engagement ring." "Ah." Bellamy's smile widened. "Congratulations. Let me show you what we've got in the private room. Nothing but the finest for a Ferraro." Luca nodded, already reaching to unbutton his coat, already rehearsing in his head the practical questions he'd need to ask, carat weight and setting, and whether platinum would hold up better than white gold against a lifetime of parties he didn't want to attend. He was so focused on the mechanics of the errand that he almost missed her entirely. Almost. She was standing at the far end of the counter with her back half turned, a jeweler's loupe pressed to one eye, examining something small and bright under the lamp with the kind of quiet concentration that used to mean the whole world had gone silent around her. She wore a dark green dress, simple and well cut, the kind of green that looked like the inside of a forest at dusk, and a beige coat draped over the back of her chair. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to frame a face Luca would have recognized blindfolded in a crowd of 1,000 women at the end of the world. Elena. The name hit him before the recognition even finished landing, an old reflex his body remembered before his mind caught up. His feet stopped moving. The velvet box in his coat pocket suddenly felt like it weighed as much as the building around him. Bellamy kept talking, something about the private viewing room and a new shipment from Antwerp, but the words dissolved into background noise, the way the ocean disappears when you're the one drowning in it. Elena set the loupe down. She must have felt the weight of someone staring because she turned and for one suspended second, her eyes found his across the length of the counter, and Luca watched 6 years collapse into nothing at all. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop anything dramatically the way it happened in the stories his younger cousins liked to watch on their phones. She just went very still, the way a person goes still when they see a ghost they'd made peace with never seeing again, and her lips parted slightly, like she meant to say something, and then thought better of it. "Elena," Luca said. Her name came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by 6 years of not saying it out loud. "Luca." Her voice was steadier than his. It always had been. "I didn't know you still came here." "I don't. Usually." He glanced down at the velvet box shape outlined against his coat, suddenly aware of it in a way that made his stomach turn over. "My father sent me." "Right." Something flickered across her face. There and gone so fast he might have imagined it if he hadn't spent 2 years of his life learning every one of her expressions by heart. Of course. Bellamy, sensing the sudden change in the air the way good shopkeepers always do, cleared his throat gently. You two know each other? A long time ago, Elena said, before Luca could answer. She said it simply, without weight, the way you'd describe a city you used to live in and hadn't thought about in years. It landed harder than if she'd screamed at him. Elena's one of our gemologists, Bellamy explained, oblivious to the current running underneath his words. Best eye in the city for a flawed stone. We're lucky to have her. She started with us, 2 years ago now? 2 years in August, Elena said. Luca stood there in the middle of the shop, holding a box for one woman's ring while looking at the only woman he'd ever actually wanted to give one to, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had absolutely no idea what to say next. To understand the silence that stretched out between them in that small gold-lit room, you have to understand what Luca Ferraro had walked away from 6 years earlier, and why he'd never once let himself go looking for it again. They had met the ordinary way, back when Luca was 28 and still working underneath his father's shadow instead of standing at the center of it, back before 3 separate assassination attempts and one very ugly territory war had carved the last of the softness out of his face. Elena had been 22, fresh out of a gemology program she'd paid for with 2 part-time jobs and a scholarship she'd fought hard for, working her first counter position at a small independent jeweler downtown, the kind of shop that survived on repairs and estate sales rather than any Ferraro-sized money. He'd walked in to have a cufflink reset. She'd caught the flaw in the setting before he'd even finished explaining what was wrong with it, told him bluntly that whoever had done the original work should be embarrassed of themselves, and then spent 45 minutes fixing it herself at the bench in the back, while he sat on an uncomfortable stool and watched her hands work with a precision that fascinated him more than he wanted to admit. He came back the next week with a watch that didn't need fixing at all. She knew exactly what he was doing, called him out on it with a raised eyebrow and a small, unimpressed smile, and let him take her to coffee anyway. For 18 months after that, Luca Ferraro had a life that existed almost entirely outside the family's orbit. He met Elena at a diner 2 neighborhoods away from anywhere his father's men might recognize him. He learned to sit through her rambling explanations of clarity grades and inclusion patterns with genuine interest instead of polite patience. He learned that she laughed with her whole body, that she cried at the ends of movies that weren't even sad, that she kept a chipped ceramic dish by her front door specifically for loose change because her grandmother had done the same thing. He never told her what his family did. Not directly. She knew his last name meant something in certain circles, the way everybody in this city eventually learned which names meant something, but she never asked the ugly questions, and for a while, he let himself believe that meant she didn't know, or didn't want to. She knew. She just didn't care, not in the way he expected her to. The end came on a night neither of them saw coming. A rival family, the Brescias, had been probing the edges of Ferraro territory for months, testing weaknesses, looking for a soft place to press a knife. Somebody, somewhere down the chain, had figured out that Salvatore's son had a girl he saw twice a week at the same diner on the same nights. A girl with no security, no name that meant anything, no protection at all. Luca found out 3 days before anything happened to her, through a source inside the Brescia camp who owed him a favor. He never told Elena the details. He never told her anything in the end. He simply stopped showing up. He changed his number. He had Antonio quietly make sure she was safe from a careful distance, close enough to intervene, far enough that she'd never know he was watching. And he let her believe he'd simply grown tired of her, that whatever they'd had together had been exactly as disposable as every other rumor about men like him suggested it would be. It was, he told himself at the time, the kindest cruelty available to him. Better a woman angry at a coward than a woman buried because of one. He never forgot the last voicemail she left him, the one he listened to exactly once and then deleted because he couldn't survive listening to it twice. Her voice hadn't been angry in it. That was the part that haunted him. It had been confused and hurt and quietly asking what she'd done wrong, as if any of this had ever been about something she'd done. 6 years. He'd told himself it would fade. It hadn't. It had just gone quiet, the way certain kinds of pain learn to go quiet if you feed them enough distraction, and enough work, and enough nights that end in exhaustion instead of thought. And now she was standing 4 feet away from him in a green dress, examining diamonds for a living, looking at him like she was doing careful math on whether it was safe to feel anything at all. "I should let you two get to your appointment," Elena said, breaking the silence first, reaching for her coat with hands that were almost steady. "Bellamy, I've got the Hartwell estate pieces cataloged if you need me. I'll be in the back." Elena. Luca said her name again before he could stop himself. He didn't know what he meant to follow it with. He just knew he wasn't ready for her to walk away a second time. She paused, one arm through her coat sleeve, and looked at him with an expression that was carefully, deliberately blank. "It's good to see you're doing well, Luca." Then she walked past him, close enough that he caught the faint scent of something clean and floral that hit him like a physical blow, some part of his memory that had never actually stopped waiting for exactly that smell, and disappeared through the door marked "Staff Only" at the back of the shop. Bellamy cleared his throat again, gently steering Luca toward the private viewing room. "Shall we look at some settings, Mr. Ferraro?" Luca stood there a moment longer, staring at the swinging door she'd vanished through, before he finally nodded and followed the old man into the back room, though for the first time in his adult life, he genuinely could not have told anyone what he was doing there. The viewing room was small and soundproofed, lined with dark wood and soft lighting designed to make every stone look like the last one you'd ever need to see. Bellamy laid out 3 trays of rings on black velvet, narrating carat weights and clarity grades and the provenance of each cut, and Luca nodded along at the right moments while roughly none of it landed in his brain at all. "This one's a classic," Bellamy said, holding up a solitaire and a platinum band, the diamond catching the light and throwing small, fractured rainbows across the ceiling. 2 carats, excellent clarity, the kind of stone that photographs well at every angle. Popular choice for a formal engagement. "It's fine," Luca said. Bellamy paused, glancing up. In 30 years of selling rings to men who were either desperately in love or desperately trying to prove something, he'd developed a fairly reliable instinct for telling the two apart. "Fine?" "It's a good ring, Bellamy. I'm sure Isabella will like it." "Isabella." Bellamy repeated the name carefully, setting the ring back down. "That's the lucky woman?" "That's the arrangement," Luca said, and immediately regretted the honesty of it, the way it slipped out of him unguarded, a crack in the composure he usually kept sealed shut around anyone outside his own family. He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Forgive me, long week." Bellamy, old enough and wise enough to know exactly which silences were his to fill and which ones weren't, simply nodded and moved on to the next tray. "No trouble at all, Mr. Ferraro. Take your time." But Luca's mind wasn't in the room anymore. It was on the other side of that swinging door, in whatever back office Elena had disappeared into, trying to piece together 6 years of a life she'd built without him in it. 2 years at Bellamy's, a gemology certification she must have completed on her own after he'd left, an apartment somewhere in the city he didn't know the address of, a routine he wasn't a part of, a whole architecture of a life that had gone on perfectly well without his presence in it, which should have been a relief and instead felt like a wound reopening in real time. "Mr. Ferraro?" Bellamy's voice cut back through the fog. This one's a favorite of mine. Emerald cut. Very old European craftsmanship. Reminds me of a piece we sold years ago, actually, to a young man buying for his sweetheart. Lovely couple. I remember because he came back every week for a month before he finally worked up the nerve to buy it. Luca's stomach dropped. He recognized the ring the second Bellamy set it on the velvet. He recognized it because he'd stood in a similar room, 6 years earlier, staring at that exact style, at a young jeweler's counter across town, trying to decide if he was brave enough to ask Elena a question he never got the chance to ask. He hadn't remembered choosing it, not consciously, not until this exact moment, but some part of him clearly had. His taste hadn't changed in 6 years. Neither, apparently, had what his heart had actually wanted, buried underneath every practical decision he'd made since. "I'll take the solitaire," Luca said abruptly, his voice rougher than intended. "The first one. Box it up." Bellamy blinked, mildly surprised at the sudden decision after 20 minutes of careful deliberation, but he was a professional above all else. "Of course, sir. I'll have it wrapped right away." While Bellamy disappeared to handle the paperwork, Luca sat alone in the small viewing room, the emerald-cut ring still sitting on the velvet tray in front of him, and he understood, with the sudden clarity of a man finally admitting something he'd spent 6 years refusing to look at directly, that he had walked into this shop today already carrying more than one kind of unfinished business. He found her in the small courtyard behind the shop 20 minutes later, the ring box now sealed in a small gold bag hanging heavy from his hand. The courtyard was little more than a service alley with 2 wrought iron chairs and a struggling potted tree, but it was quiet, tucked away from the street, the kind of place employees went to eat lunch or take a breath between customers. Elena was sitting on one of the chairs with a paper cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, staring at nothing in particular, and when the back door creaked open behind her, she didn't need to turn around to know exactly who it was. "You bought the ring," she said flatly, not a question. "How do you know that?" "Because Bellamy's been humming since he wrapped it, and because you never do anything halfway, Luca. You never have." She finally turned to look at him, arms wrapped around herself against the cold that had crept into the alley now that the sun was dipping behind the buildings. "Congratulations, by the way. Isabella. Is that Conti's daughter? I heard the families were talking about a match, back when I still followed that kind of gossip. You kept up with it." "For a while." A small, humorless laugh escaped her. "Old habits. You spend 2 years falling in love with someone's whole life, and it doesn't just switch off because he stops calling." The words landed exactly as hard as she meant them to. Luca stepped further into the alley, letting the door swing shut behind him, sealing them both into the small, quiet space with nothing but a struggling tree and 6 years of unanswered questions between them. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owed me one 6 years ago." Elena stood up, tossing the untouched coffee into a nearby bin with more force than necessary. "You don't owe me anything now. You're getting married, Luca, to someone whose family probably makes a great deal more sense for a man in your line of work than a jeweler's assistant with a student loan she's still paying off. It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" Her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to betray the calm she was working so hard to hold on to. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it looked like 6 years ago. You disappear, you show up again on your own timeline, and I'm supposed to just stand here and pretend my whole chest isn't caving in." Luca opened his mouth to answer and found, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he didn't have a rehearsed line ready. He'd spent a career negotiating with men who wanted him dead. He'd learned to talk his way out of rooms where the wrong word meant a war. And standing in front of the one person whose opinion of him had never once been about leverage, he had nothing. "There was a threat against you," he finally said, the words coming out slow and heavy, like something he was digging up from 6 years underground. 6 years ago, the Brescias found out about us. They were going to use you to get to me. I found out 3 days before it would have happened." Elena's arms slowly uncrossed. Something in her face shifted, the anger giving way, just barely, to something more careful. What kind of threat? The kind I don't talk about with people outside the family, Luca said. The kind that ends badly for the person who isn't protected. I had two choices. I could bring you into that world completely, put security on you around the clock, tell you the truth about everything I am, and everything that comes with loving me, and hope you were strong enough to live inside it. Or I could disappear, and let you hate me, and keep you safe from a distance you'd never even know I was watching. You chose for me, Elena said quietly. You didn't even give me the choice. I know. You let me think I wasn't enough. You let me spend a year wondering what I did wrong, Luca. I used to replay every conversation we ever had looking for the moment I ruined it. Her eyes were bright now, angry tears she was clearly furious at herself for allowing. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? To think it was your fault, when the whole time it was some decision you made in a room I wasn't even allowed into? I know, Luca said again, and this time his voice broke slightly too, a crack in 6 years of careful composure. I know, Elena, I've known it every day since. I told myself it was mercy. Maybe it was just cowardice wearing a nicer name. The alley went quiet except for the distant hum of traffic on 5th Street and the rustle of the struggling potted tree in the cold wind. Elena stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for a lie, the way she used to when they were younger, and she was still learning how to trust the world enough to believe someone might actually be telling her the truth. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Luca said. I'm not even sure I'm allowed to ask you that. I just needed you to know it wasn't about you. It was never about you. That's a very convenient thing to tell yourself, Elena said, but there was less venom in it now, more exhaustion. It doesn't change anything, Luca. You're marrying someone else in a few weeks. I'm not going to stand in an alley and unpack 6 years of grief just so you can feel better about the wedding. I haven't set a date. That's not the point. Maybe it is. Luca took a step closer, close enough now that he could see the small constellation of freckles across her nose that he used to trace with his thumb on quiet mornings, close enough to smell that same clean floral scent that had ambushed him inside the shop. I bought that ring 20 minutes ago because my father told me to. I've been telling myself for 3 weeks that this is what's left for a man like me, that the other kind of life, the kind where you marry someone because you can't imagine breathing right without them, isn't available to people who do what I do. And then I walked into that shop today and saw you, and every single practical reason I had for going through with this suddenly sounded like something somebody else made up. Elena's breath caught, visible in the cold air between them. Don't do this to me, Luca. Don't stand in this alley and say things like that and then go home and put a ring on someone else's finger in 3 weeks. I'm not going to. You don't get to decide that right now, out of guilt, standing in an alley. I'm not deciding it out of guilt. Luca's voice was steady now, the uncertainty burning off like fog under morning sun, replaced by the same quiet, immovable conviction he used whenever he'd made up his mind about something that actually mattered. I'm deciding it because I spent 6 years lying to myself about what I actually wanted, and I am done doing that. I don't know if you can forgive me. I don't know if there's a version of us that survives what I did to you, but I am not walking back into that shop and pretending the last 20 minutes of my life didn't happen. Before Elena could answer, the back door banged open and Bellamy stuck his head out into the alley, his expression tight with an urgency that had nothing to do with jewelry. Mr. Ferraro, your man Antonio is asking for you out front. He says it's urgent. Luca's jaw tightened instantly, the softness of the last few minutes replaced by the familiar, practiced alertness of a man who had learned the hard way that urgent, in his world, rarely meant anything good. He looked back at Elena, torn between two versions of himself standing in the exact same body. "Go," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, go. This isn't finished." "I know," she said, and for the first time since he'd walked through that green door, something that almost resembled hope flickered across her face before she carefully smoothed it away again. "Go, Luca." He went, but not before he reached out and, for one brief second, pressed his hand against hers, an old habit neither of them had entirely forgotten how to answer. Then he turned and disappeared back through the door, leaving Elena alone in the cold alley with a struggling potted tree and a heart she'd spent 6 years convincing herself was fully healed. Antonio was waiting just inside the front of the shop, his broad shoulders blocking most of the doorway, his expression carrying the particular stillness he reserved for situations that required calm more than force. He was a big man, built like something you'd want on your side in a fight, rather than against you, with a quiet efficiency that had made him invaluable to Luca over the past several years. "What is it?" Luca said, already scanning the street through the front window out of instinct. "Isabella's outside," Antonio said, keeping his voice low enough that Bellamy, hovering nearby with the gift bag still in his hands, couldn't easily overhear. "She came by the house looking for you. Your father told her you'd be here." Luca closed his eyes briefly. Of course his father had. Salvatore never missed an opportunity to demonstrate to the Conti family exactly how seriously the Ferraros were taking this alliance, and sending his future daughter-in-law to surprise his son mid-errand had all the fingerprints of exactly that kind of performance. "Is she alone?" "Her driver's with her. No security beyond that. She said she wanted to see the ring before it was a surprise. Said something about wanting input on the setting." Antonio's expression didn't change, but there was something careful in the way he delivered that last part, a warning dressed up as information. Luca glanced toward the back of the shop, toward the door that led to the alley, toward the woman he'd just left standing there with half a confession still hanging unfinished in the cold air between them. Then he looked out the front window, where a black car was idling at the curb, and through the tinted glass he could just make out the shape of a woman waiting with the kind of patience that came from a lifetime of being taught that patience was a virtue expected of daughters like her. "Tell her I'll be right out," Luca said. He handed the gift bag to Antonio without another word and walked toward the front door, every step feeling heavier than the last, like a man walking toward a version of his life he'd already quietly decided, in the last 20 minutes, that he no longer wanted. Isabella Conti stepped out of the car the moment she saw him, and even through the tangled mess of everything happening in his chest, Luca could admit, with the same detached honesty he applied to every other observation in his life, that she was every bit as striking as his father had promised. She was 26, with dark hair pinned in an elegant twist, and the kind of poised, careful beauty that came from a childhood spent being trained for exactly this kind of public appearance. She wore a cream coat over a tailored dress, and she smiled at him with genuine warmth when he reached her, the sort of smile that made it easy to understand why his father thought this arrangement was a gift rather than a sentence. "I hope this isn't an intrusion," Isabella said, her accent softening the edges of her English in a way that still, after months of formal dinners and careful courtship, sounded slightly foreign to his ear. "Your father said you were choosing the ring today. I thought perhaps I could help, or at least see it before all of Palermo does." "It's not an intrusion," Luca said, and meant it, though not for the reasons she probably assumed. "I already made the choice." "Already?" Isabella's eyebrows lifted, a flicker of surprise crossing her composed features. "That was fast, even for you." "I know what I want," Luca said, and the words carried a weight neither of them could have anticipated, a double meaning only he understood. Isabella, can we talk? Somewhere private? Something in his tone must have registered, because the easy warmth in her expression cooled slightly, replaced by the careful attentiveness of a woman who had been raised in a world where tone mattered as much as words, sometimes more. Of course. They walked a short distance down the block, away from the shop windows and the idling cars, to a small stone bench outside the bakery, empty at this hour, except for the smell of bread drifting out through a propped open door. Isabella sat first, folding her hands neatly in her lap, and waited. Luca stood in front of her, hands in his coat pockets, searching for a version of this conversation that wouldn't feel like a betrayal of the careful respect they had built toward each other over the last several months, and finding, once again, that honesty was the only version available to him. I need to tell you something, and I need you to know it isn't about you, he began. You've done nothing wrong. You've been nothing but gracious through this entire process, and you deserve better than a husband who's already thinking about somebody else. Isabella's expression didn't change immediately, but her hands tightened slightly in her lap, the only sign that his words had actually landed. Someone else, she repeated. I assume you don't mean one of your father's business partners. There was a woman, before all of this, before our families started talking. Luca sat down beside her, close enough for conversation but respectful of the space between them. I loved her. I walked away from her to protect her, because of things happening in my world at the time, things I won't burden you with. I told myself that was the end of it. Today, I found out it wasn't. She's here. Isabella's gaze drifted, unerringly, toward the jewelry shop down the block. She was sharp, sharper than his father had given her credit for, and Luca watched the pieces assemble themselves behind her eyes, with a speed that would have made her a formidable player in his world, if she'd been born into a different position within it. The woman in the back office, the one who catalogued the estate pieces. You noticed her. I notice everyone in a room, Luca. It's a habit my father drilled into me before I could walk properly in heels. A faint, unreadable smile touched Isabella's lips, something between amusement and resignation. I saw the way you looked toward that door when we spoke on the phone this morning about the appointment. I told myself I was imagining it. Luca exhaled slowly, some of the tension easing out of his shoulders at her composure, though guilt still sat heavy in his chest. I'm sorry, Isabella. This isn't fair to you. Our families built this arrangement expecting a wedding, and I have no right to unravel that because of feelings I buried badly 6 years ago. To his surprise, Isabella laughed, soft and genuine, the sound catching him entirely off guard. You think I don't understand feelings buried badly, Luca? She turned to face him fully, and for the first time since they'd met, something guarded in her expression fell away, replaced by an honesty he hadn't expected. My father chose this match because it benefits the family. I agreed to it because I am a good daughter, and because you are, by every reasonable measure, a decent man in a business that rarely produces them. But I did not agree to it because my heart demanded it. My heart has been otherwise occupied for quite some time. Luca blinked, genuinely surprised. Otherwise occupied? There is a man in Palermo, a doctor. My father would never approve of him, not for the same reasons your father would approve so heartily of me. Isabella's smile turned wistful, tinged with an old, familiar kind of grief. I have spent the last year telling myself that duty matters more than desire, that a comfortable arrangement with a respectable man was more than most women in my position are offered, and that I should be grateful for it. It seems, Luca Ferraro, that we have both been telling ourselves the same convenient lies. The stone bench went quiet except for the distant sound of traffic and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery door. Luca studied the woman beside him, feeling something between relief and disbelief settle into his chest. "You're not angry." "I'm relieved," Isabella admitted. "Terrified of what my father will say, but relieved. I think I've been waiting for someone to say the truth out loud since the day this arrangement was announced, and I did not expect it would be you who said it first." "What happens now, between the families?" "That," Isabella said, standing and smoothing the front of her coat with the careful composure of a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to face difficult conversations without flinching, "is between our fathers to sort out, and it will not be pleasant. But it is not your burden to solve alone, and it is certainly not a reason to marry a woman who does not love you when there is one down that street who very clearly still does." Luca stood as well, something loosening in his chest that had been tight for so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe around it. "Thank you, Isabella, for understanding this before I even finished explaining it." "Don't thank me yet," Isabella said, echoing words she couldn't have known carried weight for him. A strange coincidence that made Luca's mouth twitch into something almost like a smile. "Our fathers are going to make this very difficult for both of us. But go talk to your jeweler, Luca. I imagine she's still waiting." She got back into the idling car, and Luca watched it pull away from the curb with a strange lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in 6 years, immediately followed by the sharp, sobering realization that Isabella was right about one thing. Their fathers were not going to take this news calmly. And Salvatore Ferraro, in particular, did not handle surprises well when they threatened carefully built alliances. He turned back toward the jewelry shop, already bracing himself for the conversation he still had to finish inside, when Antonio appeared at his side again, this time with a different kind of urgency written across his face. "Boss," Antonio said quietly, "we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "2 of Brescia's men, sitting in a car half a block down, watching the shop since before Isabella even showed up. They've been there 20 minutes. Antonio's jaw was tight, his hand resting near the inside of his jacket out of pure habit. "I don't think it's a coincidence they're here the same day you are." Luca's blood went cold, all the warmth of the last conversation replaced instantly by the sharpened alertness that 6 years of running this family had trained into him like a second heartbeat. The Brescias had been the reason he'd walked away from Elena in the first place. If they were here now, watching the same shop where she worked, on the very day he'd finally allowed himself to consider a future with her again, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. "They know," Luca said quietly, more to himself than to Antonio. "Somehow they know I was here." "It's possible they've had eyes on you since the estate," Antonio said. "This might have nothing to do with the girl. Could just be routine surveillance, testing how close they can get." "I'm not taking that chance." Luca was already moving, walking briskly back toward the green door of the shop, Antonio falling into step beside him without needing to be told. "Get 2 more men here, now. Quiet. No show of force yet. I want eyes on that car, and I want to know who's inside it within the hour." "And the shop?" "Nobody leaves until we know it's clear." Luca pushed through the front door, the small brass bell announcing his return, with the same delicate chime it always did, entirely indifferent to the fact that the man walking beneath it had just gone from softly unraveling his own heart to calculating threat assessments in the span of 30 seconds. Bellamy looked up from behind the register, his earlier warmth dimmed slightly by whatever he'd picked up from Antonio's expression as the big man swept the front windows with a practiced, searching gaze. "Is everything all right, Mr. Ferraro?" "Just a precaution," Luca said, keeping his voice level, calm, the way he'd learned to keep it in front of civilians even when his own instincts were screaming. I need to speak with Elena again. Is she still in the back? She went to the stockroom a few minutes ago, second door on the left. Luca found her exactly there, surrounded by narrow shelves of small, locked boxes and a single desk lamp casting warm light over a ledger she was updating with the same careful precision she'd once used to fix his cufflink at a different counter, in a different life. She looked up when he entered, and whatever she saw in his expression immediately wiped away the last traces of the earlier conversation's tension, replaced by a sharp, focused alertness of her own. "What's wrong?" "There are men outside," Luca said. "People from a rival family. I don't know yet if they're here because of me, but I'm not willing to guess wrong twice with your safety, Elena. Not again." Elena set down the pen, her hands steady despite the sudden shift in the air, a testament to the fact that spending 2 years loving Luca Ferraro, even briefly, had apparently taught her something about staying calm in the face of danger that most people never had to learn. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay back here. Lock the door behind me. Don't come out until Antonio or I come to get you personally." Luca stepped closer, his hand finding hers on instinct, the same way it had in the alley 20 minutes earlier. "I am not leaving this building until I know you're safe. Do you understand me?" "I understand." Elena's fingers curled around his, tight and certain. "Luca, is this because of what happened 6 years ago?" "I don't know yet." He pressed a brief kiss to the back of her hand, an old habit surfacing without permission, and stepped back toward the door. "But I'm not making the same mistake twice. I'm not disappearing on you to keep you safe. This time, I stay, and I make sure you're safe standing right beside me." Elena locked the stockroom door behind him the moment he left, and Luca walked back out into the main shop with the particular stillness that had made grown men lose their nerve mid-sentence, the softness of the last hour packed carefully away behind the same controlled composure that had kept his family's empire standing for 6 years. Antonio was waiting by the front window, phone pressed to his ear, murmuring low instructions to whoever was on the other end. He lowered it as Luca approached. "Word back already? It's not Brescia muscle, boss. It's 2 off-duty cops moonlighting surveillance for an insurance investigation. Something about a burglary ring hitting jewelry stores across 3 neighborhoods. Bellamy's shop got flagged as a possible future target because of the estate collection they just took in. Nothing to do with us at all." The relief that washed through Luca's chest was almost dizzying in its intensity, immediately followed by a wave of something closer to embarrassment at how quickly 6 years of hard-earned paranoia had sent him straight to the worst possible conclusion. "You're certain?" "Ran the plate myself. Checked twice." Antonio's mouth twitched with the ghost of a smile, the closest thing to humor the big man allowed himself on the job. "Sometimes a car parked on a street is just a car parked on a street, boss." "Not in my experience," Luca muttered, but the tension had already started draining out of his shoulders, replaced by something almost like a laugh caught in his throat, disbelief at the absurdity of the last 10 minutes. He'd stood in an alley confessing 6 years of buried love, sat on a bench dissolving an arranged engagement with startling grace, and then nearly declared a small-scale war over 2 bored police officers watching a jewelry store for an unrelated case. "You want me to stand down the extra men?" "Stand them down," Luca confirmed. "And Antonio, thank you for everything today. I know it wasn't the errand you signed up for this morning." "Wasn't the errand I expected," Antonio agreed, glancing toward the back of the shop with an expression that suggested he'd already put together far more of the day's events than either Luca or Elena had explicitly told him. "But I've worked for you 6 years, boss. I've never seen you look the way you looked walking out of that alley an hour ago. Whatever's back there, it's worth the trouble." Luca didn't answer, but the small nod he gave said enough. He crossed the shop floor and knocked twice on the stockroom door, the old signal they used to use, back before any of this had fallen apart. before 6 years of silence and one gray Thursday afternoon had somehow put them back in the same room together. The lock clicked. Elena opened the door, her face still tight with worry, scanning him for any sign of what had happened outside. "Is everyone safe?" "Everyone's safe. It was nothing, a misunderstanding." Luca stepped inside the small stockroom, pulling the door shut behind him, sealing them both once again into a quiet space that smelled of old velvet and polish and 6 years of everything they'd never said to each other. "I meant what I said before Antonio interrupted us. I'm not disappearing on you again, Elena. Not for any reason. Not even a good one." Elena studied him for a long moment, the careful walls she'd rebuilt over 6 years still visibly standing, but no longer quite as impenetrable as they'd been an hour ago. "You just called off your engagement in an alley behind a bakery, and now there might be police investigating a burglary ring outside the shop where I work. This is officially the strangest day of my entire life, Luca." "Mine too," Luca admitted, and something in his chest, some old tension he'd carried since the night he'd walked away from her 6 years ago, finally began to unknot itself. "For what it's worth, most of my days are considerably less eventful than this." "That's very reassuring, considering I nearly had a heart attack when your bodyguard's face went that particular shade of grim." A small, unwilling laugh escaped Elena, and it was the same laugh he remembered, the one that used to fill up whole rooms, the one he'd spent 6 years quietly missing without letting himself admit it. "You really told Isabella today? About us? About everything?" "I did." "And she was all right with it?" "Better than all right. Apparently she'd been carrying her own version of the same secret." Luca leaned against the edge of the small desk, watching Elena's shoulders slowly relax as the adrenaline of the last few minutes began to fade. "It seems both our fathers built a match between two people who had already, quietly, given their hearts somewhere else entirely. That's either very sad or very funny. I can't decide which." Elena crossed her arms, though the gesture had lost its earlier defensiveness, replaced now by something closer to thoughtful uncertainty. "What happens now, Luca? Your father just spent months building an alliance with the Contis. He's not going to take this news well." "No," Luca agreed. "He isn't. There will be conversations, difficult ones, probably several. My father is going to be furious, at least for a while, and there's a real chance the business relationship between our families suffers for it. That's a cost I have to be willing to pay if I'm serious about this. About you." "And are you? Serious?" "I bought a ring today," Luca said quietly, "for the wrong woman, because I told myself the right one wasn't a door I was allowed to walk back through. I was wrong. I've been wrong about that for 6 years, and I am done paying for a mistake I already regretted the moment I made it." Elena's arms slowly uncrossed. She stepped closer, close enough that Luca could see the same small constellation of freckles across her nose, close enough that 6 years suddenly felt like the thinnest possible distance instead of the enormous gulf it had felt like only an hour earlier. "I'm not going to pretend 6 years just disappears because you said some nice things in a stockroom, Luca," she said, her voice gentler now, but still carrying the careful honesty that had always been one of the things he loved most about her. "I need time. I need to trust that you're not going to vanish again the next time something dangerous shows up in your world." "I understand. Take whatever time you need." Luca reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that seemed to surprise them both. "I'm not asking you to fall back into anything tonight. I'm asking for the chance to earn it properly this time. No secrets, no disappearing. Whatever comes at us, we face it together, or we don't face it at all." Elena leaned almost imperceptibly into his palm, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, letting the quiet stockroom hold the weight of everything that had shifted in the span of a single strange afternoon. The conversation with Salvatore Ferraro happened 3 days later, in the same study where the arrangement had first been announced, and it went, by every measure, exactly as poorly as Luca had expected. "You did what?" Salvatore said, his voice dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that used to make grown men in this family flinch before he'd even finished a sentence. He was standing by the same window Luca had stood at 3 weeks earlier, though now the roles had reversed, and it was Salvatore doing the pacing, while Luca stood his ground near the door. "I told Isabella the truth, Papa, that I couldn't marry her because my heart was already given somewhere else. She agreed with me. She has her own reasons for being relieved by it, reasons that are hers to share or not share. But I promise you, this was not a decision made lightly, and it was not a decision made without her genuine understanding. Do you understand what you have done to this family? To the port agreements? Conti is going to see this as an insult, Luca, a public humiliation of his daughter. Then I will go to Palermo myself and apologize to him directly, man to man, and I will find another way to secure fair shipping terms that doesn't require marrying a woman who doesn't love me any more than I love her." Luca kept his voice level. The same careful control he'd learned from his father in the first place now turned squarely against him. "I built half this family's current business relationships myself, Papa. I can build this one too, without asking someone to sacrifice her whole life for it." Salvatore turned from the window, studying his son with an expression Luca hadn't seen in years, somewhere between fury and something that might, grudgingly, have been respect. "This is about the jeweler's girl, Antonio told me. Her name is Elena," Luca said. "And yes, this is about her. I let you talk me into believing that love was a luxury men like us don't get to keep, and I have spent 6 years quietly regretting the day I let that belief cost me the only woman I have ever wanted to build a real life with. I am not making that mistake again, Papa. Not even for you." The study went silent, the old cedar and paper smell settling heavy between them the way it always did during the family's most difficult conversations. Salvatore was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, some old argument visibly warring behind his eyes. "Your grandmother," he finally said, "would have liked her, the jeweler's girl." Luca blinked, caught entirely off guard by the sudden shift. "You never met her, Papa." "I met her once, years ago, without your knowledge." Salvatore's expression softened, just barely, the ghost of an old memory crossing his weathered face. "Antonio pointed her out to me, back when I first heard my son had a woman he wasn't telling the family about. I watched her for exactly 10 minutes through a diner window, and in that 10 minutes, she made you laugh 3 times, harder than I had heard you laugh in years. I never told you I saw that. I told myself it didn't matter, that duty came first, that the family's survival was worth more than one woman's laugh." He exhaled slowly, an old weariness in the sound. "I was wrong to make that decision for you 6 years ago, Luca. I am not going to pretend otherwise now." "You knew," Luca said quietly, something shifting uncomfortably in his chest as 6 years of carefully constructed guilt suddenly found a new, unexpected place to settle. "You knew about the threat from the Brescias, about why I really left her." "I gave the order that convinced you it was necessary," Salvatore admitted, and for the first time in Luca's memory, his father looked genuinely tired, the weight of decades of hard decisions visible on his face in a way he usually kept carefully hidden. "I told myself I was protecting this family. Perhaps I was also protecting an old, stubborn belief that men like us don't get to have both love and power in the same lifetime. I am sorry for the part I played in taking her from you, Luca. I did not understand, until I watched you standing here just now, exactly how much it cost you." Luca crossed the room and, in a gesture that surprised them both, embraced his father, an act of forgiveness neither of them had expected to offer or receive that day. "Then help me fix it, Papa. Help me find a way to make this right with Conti that doesn't require Isabella or me sacrificing what we actually want." Salvatore pulled back, studying his son's face for a long moment, before a rare, genuine smile broke across his weathered features. "You are more like your grandfather than you know, Luca. He also chose love over easy alliances. It nearly ruined him twice, and both times it turned out to be the best decision he ever made." He clapped a heavy hand on Luca's shoulder. "Bring the girl to dinner. If she survives one meal with this family, she has earned her place at this table." The meeting with Conti, when it finally happened 2 weeks later, went considerably better than either Luca or Salvatore had anticipated. It turned out that Isabella's doctor in Palermo came from a respected medical family, with connections her father valued nearly as much as he valued shipping contracts. And once the shock wore off, Conti seemed almost relieved to discover his daughter's heart had been quietly, sensibly occupied elsewhere the entire time, sparing him the discomfort of ever having to watch her settle for a marriage neither of them had truly wanted. The port agreements were renegotiated on separate, straightforward business terms within the month, no daughters required as collateral, and Isabella sent Elena a short, gracious note a few weeks later that read simply, "Thank you for reminding all of us what the arrangement was missing. I wish you both every happiness. Come to Palermo sometime. I'll introduce you to my own difficult, wonderful complication." Elena kept the note in the top drawer of her desk at Bellamy's for years afterward, a strange, unlikely souvenir of the day her entire life had quietly rearranged itself around a green door and a man she'd spent 6 years convincing herself she'd never see walk through it again. As for Luca, he returned to Bellamy & Sons exactly 4 months later, this time without an appointment, without his father's instructions, and without any velvet box already sitting in his pocket. He waited until closing, watching through the front window as Elena locked up the register and turned off the last of the display case lights. And when she finally stepped outside into the cool evening air, he was standing on the sidewalk exactly where he'd stood the very first time he'd ever worked up the nerve to ask her to coffee. "You're doing it again," Elena said, though there was no real accusation in her voice, only the warm, familiar amusement of someone who had, over 4 careful, patient months, slowly let her guard back down one honest conversation at a time. "Showing up unannounced outside my work." "Old habits," Luca said, echoing words she'd used against him once, months earlier, in a very different alley. "I was hoping you'd let me buy you dinner, and maybe, if the night goes well, let me ask you something I never actually got the chance to ask 6 years ago." Elena's eyes dropped, almost involuntarily, to the small shape in his coat pocket, and this time, when recognition crossed her face, it wasn't guarded at all. It was open, unguarded, entirely undefended. The exact expression Luca had spent 6 lonely years wishing he'd never had to walk away from in the first place. "You already bought a ring here once this year," she said softly. "Bellamy's going to think you can't make up your mind." "I made up my mind 6 years ago," Luca said. "It just took me a very long time and a very strange Thursday to finally act on it." Elena stepped closer, close enough that the cold evening air disappeared entirely between them, close enough that 6 years and every hard, careful conversation since finally collapsed into the simplest possible distance. "Ask me then." He did, and this time there was no father's arrangement waiting behind it, no alliance to secure, no threat lurking in a parked car down the block. There was only a man who had finally learned that the family he was building mattered more than the one he'd inherited, and a woman who had spent 6 years quietly, stubbornly, keeping just enough hope in reserve to say yes when he finally, properly, asked. 6 years of silence undone by one green dress and one badly timed errand. Luca Ferraro spent a career believing nothing happened by accident, and in the end, the only thing he never planned for turned out to be the one thing that mattered most. Sometimes the ring you buy for the wrong reason is the ring that leads you straight back to the right person. Would you have forgiven a man who disappeared without a word, even if he did it to protect you? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If this slow burn, second chance mafia romance pulled you in, hit that like button, share it with a friend who loves a good redemption story, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales every week. See you in the next one.